you very much for taking time out of your day to join me on this live stream. Like I mentioned, it's one of those things where we know a lot about what we do, and sometimes it helps to be able to help others who are interested in also learning a little bit more about issues they have related to marketing or related to legal issues, right? So, for everyone listening, my name is Franco Aquino. I'm co-founder of Ren Marketing. Right behind me is my business partner Julio, who's hanging out there, also listening to this live stream. And we focus on doing lead generation marketing campaigns for different businesses. And today, I'm joined by Fabian Garcia, a personal friend who I've gone to know since high school, who now is a business attorney. So, Fabian, before we get started, please tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us about what you're currently doing, and then we'll take it from there.
Sure. So before anything, thank you for having me on. I really appreciate you putting all of this together, and I'm very excited to be here. So, as you mentioned, you and I go way back. I think we hadn't seen each other in a couple of years, and then we ran into each other, and here we are. So I did my undergraduate at Florida International University, where I had some classes with Julio, I think, and I majored in psychology. And then while I was doing that, I kind of, flirted with the idea of going to law school. And then it ended up happening. So I graduated from the University of Miami. It went pretty well for me. I graduated with honors. And initially, I thought that, I was going to do litigation, which means, I was going to be going to court and all that. And then I shortly realized that that was not for me personally. But I fell in love with transactional work. So what I do now is I help business owners, kind of navigate the legal world, right? Because it can get a little complex. I try to assist them with forming their entities or negotiating with other parties and things like that. And I also do commercial real estate. So those are the areas that I primarily focus on. And my goal, is to make my clients feel comfortable while they're making these like important business decisions, right? Because for a lot of people, they're putting all of their hard-earned money into their business, and what they want is, to have some sort of comfort while they're investing the money. So that's what I
Great.
do, and I'm only licensed to practice law in Florida, but yeah,
Thanks for
I
the
assist the
disclaimer.
Florida residents.
Yeah. No, but that's great. And I want to say that when I was thinking about how to get started doing these live streams, I was thinking about what some questions are that I generally have from business owners, right? And as a business owner myself, working with other businesses, generally there's a lot of legal questions that people have before they even get started, right? And I know that when I started Ren, I read a lot about the process of starting a business, but there were also some things that it took me a while to figure out. So when we reconnected, I was like, look, I might be a great idea to be able to do a live stream like this to answer some of the questions that people have that maybe they haven't been able to get answers for, right? Because the more confident you can make someone feel in a particular area, in this case it's law, it's legal, it's setting up a business, it helps them take the next step. In this case, in this case, it would be creating a business. So in this particular video, for everyone listening, thank you for paying attention to this video. We're going to get started with a little bit of a setup, and then go into some common questions that people have really when it comes to starting a business. Some legal questions that Fabian here will be able to address. Following that, we're going to have a Q&A. So if you have any questions and you're live on LinkedIn, you'll be able to ask some questions there. And then depending on if it's something that Fabian can comment, he'll be able to comment. And then finally, we're going to give you an opportunity to get in contact with Fabian for anything down the road. So a little bit of a setup. Like I mentioned, there are a lot of people that want to be business owners, right? And it's really easy to set up a business here in the US, especially in Florida, for example. But there are many things that you need to do. Maybe it's creating the LLC, it's opening up the bank account, getting the EIN to make it happen, right? There's a lot of things that if you've never done it, you don't know where to start, right? So some of these questions are focused on really that very first step, which it's easy, but someone who hasn't done it someone who doesn't hasn't really had a background in business, which, I studied at FIU. I did my finance and marketing, and in those classes they went over a little bit about the difference between an LLC, corporation, etc. So I kind of knew a little bit about that, right? But I know that most people, if they haven't gone that route, they might not know um, that at all. So when it comes to the first question, and at any point, Fabian, if you want to add something, you want to maybe rephrase, let me know. But when it comes to the type of business structure, right? What type should people form and why?
Right. So I think you hit the nail on the head, right? A lot of people, they get excited, with their business idea, and they just kind of go off and do their own thing, right? The main example that I give is, for example, if I bake cupcakes at my house, right, and I make some killer cupcakes, um, the main thing that business owners need to be wary of is, their protections, right? If I don't file anything with the state, right, my assets are going to be at risk. So what I mentioned earlier about me selling the cupcakes, that would be a sole proprietorship, right? You don't want that. Nobody wants that, because you could face liability for the things that your business does, right? So typically what we see is small business owners, what they do is they create what's called a limited liability company, right? An LLC. So what an LLC does is it keeps the business owner separate from the company, right? And this is ideal because you don't want to be answering, for example, if something happens with the company, you don't want them to be taking your house, right? That's the last
Mhm.
thing that people want. So that's the main thing that we see. I think it just depends on the type of business that the person decides to enter in. Um, but typically, as I mentioned, it will be an LLC, and it's, as you mentioned, also it's fairly easy to set up, right? All you need to do is you file the articles of organization with the state, and you're pretty much set. Now, as a side note, right?
Mhm.
Even though for a lot of these things, individuals can do them themselves, it's not advisable, right? Because you always want to have an attorney who is experienced in drafting these documents to avoid any sort of litigation or any ambiguities or problems with your business partner and things like that. So that would be kind of like the main business structure.
Okay. And I think it's great that you brought up the example of the cupcakes, because I know a lot of people who, they're very entrepreneurial. They do a lot of things themselves without setting up a business. So I think it's one thing that hasn't really come to my mind, because I've always learned, like, do an LLC. But I'm guessing it really is a good point to remind people who've never started a business that perhaps you don't want to put yourself at risk when you can just do something as simple as creating a separate entity to get your business going, right?
No, of course,
um
and oh, sorry, and then something else that I wanted to add. It's, there's a lot of entities that people can choose from, right? Because they could do a general partnership, limited partnership, sorry, corporations and things like that. And typically for small business owners, these other entity types don't make sense. For example, corporations, right? There's so many formalities that you're required to have by state, or that if it's just you that's running the company, you don't really need that. You don't need to pay those extra fees for having a corporation. What you want is something that's going to allow you to run your business, right? You don't want to be thinking about, oh my God, I have to write this paper down or like sign this or pay this. No, you want to focus on your business, and that's it.
okay, perfect. Yeah, I agree. I think everything has their own different processes. And I remember reading the corporation one. I think you need to do like minutes, you need to do your shareholders like announcements, stuff like that. So yeah, it always sounds exciting to do a corporation, right? Because that's what the big companies
Yeah,
are,
right.
right? I guess at some point transfer over to a corporation and no longer be an LLC.
You'd be surprised that some of them also decide to go the LLC route, and sometimes for that very reason, right? Corporations, yeah, they can be a bit tedious, and at the end of the day, the main concern, as I mentioned in the beginning, it's not being liable, right? As a business owner, you do
Mhm.
not want to be liable. You do not want to put your family's assets at risk. You just want to be kept separate. And I think that's something that I really try to hammer in, right? Because some people are like, oh, I'll just be a sole proprietor because I don't need to pay anything. Well, yeah, that's great. But in the event that you get sued, and most businesses inevitably they get sued at some point, right? If you get
Mhm.
big enough, you're going to get sued. And then you want to have those protections in place. Now,
Good point.
sometimes courts they do they if under every rule has an exception, right? So under certain circumstances, courts will be like, okay, no, like even though you have an LLC, it doesn't matter. We're still going to hold you liable, right? It's not just like a shield that you can just lift up and
Yeah.
you're always going to be good. That's not how it works.
Does that depend on like the crime or what you did?
It just depends on, for example, if you're commingling funds is a good one, right? If the
Mhm.
LLC is just like an what they call an alter ego of yourself, then you're gonna be held
You're not
liable.
managing it separately, pretty much.
Correct. If, for example,
Gotcha.
if yeah, exactly, right. So under those circumstances, that's something else that I tell clients is you want to be kept separate. If you want to be treated separate, be kept separate, and you'll be okay.
Perfect. And then the next question, which you already went over a little bit, but I just want to, I'd like for you to be able to go over again, right? The next question is, what's the process to form an LLC? And specifically in this case, you could give us an example of Florida, right?
Right. So in Florida, as I mentioned, it's relatively easy to create your LLC. All you need to do is file a legal document called the Articles of Organization, right? And the Articles of Organization, what it does is essentially it lays out the very basic information about your company. So, for example, it will ask you to lay out the name, who the registered agent is. This is the person that is going to be receiving service in case you get sued. The address of your company, and some optional things as well, right? What's your company going to do? What are you going to sell? What services, right? But that's
Hmm.
that's not mandatory, though. In some cases you might want to put that in there. And then again, like it's very basic. Now you can go on like Rocket Lawyer, right? And then you can pretty much set this up all by yourself, right?
Uh-huh.
But the problem becomes is that it's not a one size fits all, right? What
Mhm.
works for your company, for your marketing company, may not necessarily work for another marketing company, right? So that's why it's so important that clients receive like individual service, right? A personalized
Mhm.
service, right? And that would be the very basic document, right? And one of the things that gets overlooked a lot of times is a document called the operating agreement, right? And
Mhm.
here I'm pretty much dealing with LLC since that's the basic,
The
uh,
most popular one, yeah.
the most popular one that small business owners go for. The operating agreement, and what this agreement does is it's pretty much an agreement amongst the members of the LLC, right? So it'll tell
Mhm.
you, hey, for example, you and Julio, right? Okay, in the event that we dissolve, how are our assets going to be split up, right? How are
Mhm.
we going to get taxed? How are we going to vote on certain things, right? Can we
Mhm.
acquire real property? Like, what do we need to do that, right? And a lot
Mhm.
of companies they just leave this out, and then when that certain scenario comes up, then what, right? Then you're
Yeah,
faced with controversy, and that can sometimes be problematic, right? So I
definitely.
like to think of, if you're going to file your articles of organization, you might want to do, and I strongly suggest also doing an operating agreement, right? To avoid any miscommunications, to avoid any issues, you have that as well.
Perfect. Perfect. Good point. All right. And then another popular question that I get from, sometimes friends and family, it's how do I open a business bank account, right? And I know that this goes hand in hand with, the previous steps. So I think that this is a really good question to go over.
Right. So opening a bank account, once you have the articles of organization, you're pretty much set. The only other thing that most banks will ask you for is an EIN. What that stands for is the employer identification number, right? And you will get this on the IRS website, and you'll basically fill in some information regarding your company, and you'll get it in minutes. And this is going to allow you to get credit cards, and then depending on the bank they might ask you for different information. And then just kind of like to hammer in on the point that I was making earlier about the operating agreement, and it goes hand in hand with banks, right? If you go to an accountant or an attorney, typically the first thing that they will ask you for is the operating agreement, right? Because in certain instances, your partner is also going to have to approve of the accountant that you get, or the lawyer that you're going to get, or how the legal fees are going to get paid out, and things like that. So typically, that is something that's also covered in the operating agreement.
Mhm.
But to open a bank account, you wouldn't particularly need an operating agreement. They typically just ask you for the articles and the EIN.
Perfect. And I think that sometimes they also ask for a lease if you're using a different location that is
Did they
not your
ask you
home.
for that?
Yeah, they asked me for that.
Okay.
Right. I know it's not always the case, depending on the business and depending where you are, or depending on if you use your home address or your business address. But I know that that's something that sometimes they'll ask. But I think
Right.
that's a
It
good
might
point.
also. Oh no,
Go
go
ahead.
ahead. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, what I was going to say is that I think it's a good point to also bring up this question because just like you mentioned, if you have an LLC, but you don't have things separated, so you don't have a separate bank account, you can come across the issue, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, where I think the term is pierce the corporate veil or something like that, right?
Yes. So
So,
that's it. So the example that I was giving you earlier about the commingling of the funds, that's a
mhm,
prime example of piercing the corporate veil, which is what courts do, right? So that what the way they view it is kind of like the shield, and the court is piercing it, right? Because again, you are the alter ego of your company. There's no difference between you and the company. You are using the assets; they're your they're pretty much your assets, and you're just kind of you just have the LLC to say you have the LLC, and that to try to protect yourself, but it just won't work that way. And then if fraud is committed and then other things, then you're more likely to have that pierced as well.
yeah,
Um,
that
and
makes sense.
then also it's something to be wary of in single member LLCs, right? Because LLCs you can have multi-member LLCs and single member LLCs, and I think it's typically most of a downfall in single member LLCs because it's just you, right?
Mhm.
And there's kind of nobody to hold you accountable of how you're using your funds, right?
Yeah,
Um, so that's something to take note of as well.
that's good. It also makes the accountant's life easier.
Right.
Well, which I know it does help a lot.
Yeah.
Now, for the next question. So, how does a business owner protect themselves from liability?
Right. So this is one of the main points, right, that we were discussing is you want to have an entity that is going to protect you, right? For example, if my cupcakes, going back to the cupcake example, if I'm a sole proprietor and one of my cupcakes get you sick, you are going to sue me, Fabian, right, as an individual, and I'm going to have to respond for that, right? If I have an LLC, for example, the best cupcakes ever LLC, you're not going to sue me, Fabian, personally. You're going to sue the LLC because the LLC is the one that's selling you the cupcakes, right? And in that case, if I'm doing everything the way that I'm supposed to be doing it, my
Mhm.
assets are in the clear. The company is going to be the one responding to you. Is the company getting sued? Not me, right? So the best way to do it is to have an entity that will offer you those protections. So, for example, corporations, they offer limited liability. LLCs, they get you that limited liability. If it's in some partnerships, right? Some partnerships, they will
Mhm.
offer that limited liability as well. So you just want to make sure that whatever entity it is that you choose, that first you ask an attorney about which one works for your business and the one that makes most sense for you. And then after that, you just make sure that you're protected in any level, right? At all levels, sorry.
Yeah. And that you're keeping everything separate.
Exactly, exactly. Keep it separate always.
Yeah. No, I think it's important to, too because most people will need a credit card to do business, right? So
Right.
why would you want to do business with your personal credit card if you could have a business credit card that you manage separately, that you keep an eye differently? So I think it's extremely important to know that. The thing
Right.
that happens is that for most people, and this was my case, when we started up the company, like I had to do all the research, right? And I wish that, I mean, I did come across some articles that had a lot of these things all in one, but it took me a while to figure out. Like I read this, I'd read that, I'd read how to open up a bank account, and then I'd go and they'd be like, ah, psych, you need this too, right? So I think it's good to know everything in general when possible. Like
Right.
there's a saying that I like where it's like, you don't know what you don't know, right? And you could figure it out before, it's even better, before you need it, right?
Right.
Now, when it comes to licenses, right? What licenses or permits are required to properly operate a business in a specific area, in your city, in your state, etc.?
Right. So that's a question that's very industry specific, right? For example, if you're selling food products, you're not going to need the same licenses as your marketing agency, for example, right? There's going to be in the at the local, state, and federal level, you're going to have different licenses that you're going to need, but it's so industry specific that I wouldn't be able to generalize it like that, right? Um, but typically, you know, and going back again, what you want to do is you want to have an attorney who can do the research for you, right? Who's going to do the research for you and is going to tell you, hey, at the federal level, you're going to need ABC. At the state level, you're going to need da da da, right? You don't want to be operating your business thinking everything is okay while you don't have your licenses, right? That you don't want to open yourself to
Yeah.
liability. And I think especially for me, right, as a transactional attorney, what I want to do is to make sure that my clients are all good in the transactions that they do, right? I don't want to make them look bad if, for example, if we're going to be conducting business with a big distributor, that we get to the table and it's like, hey, like you don't have what you don't even have like the licenses
Yeah.
to be here, right? We don't want that because that makes the client look bad. That makes me look bad. We don't want that, right? We want to make the client and ourselves look as professional as possible.
Yeah. And could you talk a little bit about the professional type of licenses? I remember we had a discussion about it, and I know that CPAs, lawyers, they need to have something like that. Which I'm sure lawyers know this, but in case some other types of professionals, they might not know. So what does that look like?
Right. So in certain professions, as you can see from the name of my firm, right, Apex Legal Solutions PLLC, it's not a typical LLC, right? It has a P in front because there's certain industries that you are required to, or that Florida allows you to have the PLLC to let people know that, for example, me, right, as a Florida licensed attorney, I need to be in good standing with the Florida bar, right? What does this mean,
Mhm.
right? Apart from being a lawyer, apart from not committing malpractice, and apart from doing my part, I need to take what is known as CLEs, right? These are continuing legal education. They're like seminars, right? So I have to constantly be like studying my craft, right, to put it in a better way, so that I can be providing good legal service, right? And you need to pay your dues as well. You need to pay the state a fee. Um, realtors, they also they got to go through the certification. Accountants, they also got to do their thing. So again, very very industry specific. And I don't know, for example, if you were required for your marketing agency, what licenses you were required to bring on.
No, we just needed to do, like, for example, local business tax receipt that I know that a lot of businesses haven't really kept up to date. When we had to do that, they actually went in to do like an inspection and whatnot, and just to let us know how it was. Because when, for some permits, like the one that we did, they sent someone over to just check that we weren't holding any inventory or specific things.
Mhm.
And then that's where I learned that most businesses, they don't know about that in particular, for example.
Right, right, and then it's like a headache that to deal with later on. Is if you're already conducting your business, it's a headache to deal with, right?
Yeah, and I think it comes down to maybe the type, like you mentioned, the type of business, right? I think when you have a physical location, there's going to be, of course, a lot more steps in in the process of setting up a business, right? You need to have some businesses I know that I've worked with before. They've had to get like a fire department inspection, or they had to get some type of permission to open their doors to the public because they had to redesign and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just industry specific like that, but it could also be in regards to having the a building that you're letting people into.
Right. Yeah. No. Of course. Right. Like in certain instances, right, you need to have like a building that's ADA compliant, right? So people can pass by in a wheelchair if they need
Exactly.
it, things like that. That the bathroom stalls are the size that they need to be for again people that have ADA accommodations and things like that.
Mhm.
But yeah, you're absolutely right. If you're in a building, right, you have to follow not only federal, state, but you're also like, for example, we live in Doral, right? So, and the Doral city ordinances, you need to follow them in order for you to conduct your business, right? So that's also
Yeah,
something else that business owners need to be wary of.
definitely.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's a good point. And then, last but not least, right, before we head over to the notable points that Fabian has, we're going to talk about the importance of having an attorney throughout negotiations with third parties, such as customers, suppliers, or partners. What can you tell us about this, Fabian?
Right. So I think the most important thing is that you don't always have to accept the contract that is being presented to you, right? So for example, if I'm working with a distributor, I don't have to accept every single term. A lot of the things can get negotiated, right? And if you're not going in with an attorney, then you know, unfortunately, if you're dealing against an experienced attorney, if you're negotiating by yourself against an experienced attorney, then things you might not get the things that you want. Now, if you have an attorney on your side and you're negotiating with another attorney, then you're most likely to get the things that you are seeking, right? Um, Again, what we do as attorneys is we try to do what's best for our clients, right? We want to get them, for example, if you are looking for a commercial space, right, for your company, we try to negotiate the best price. We try to negotiate, the things that we need to disclose and things like that. um,
Hmm.
Attorneys at the end of the day, we're there to facilitate, right? And I think a lot of these things, a lot of the documents, as I mentioned earlier, you can find them on like Rocket Lawyer and you can do them yourself, but at the cost of you having to deal with it, with the deep repercussions of using that later on, right? So I think there's no substitute for having a good lawyer on your side, just because it's going to give you the time to focus on what matters, which is running your business, right? And
Perfect.
I think the vast, even though lawyers get a bad rep, right? I truly think that most lawyers have the client's best interest at heart, right? Like
Mhm.
yes, some may upcharge and things like that, but some of them do are genuinely invested in their client's business and they want them to succeed, right? And
Mhm.
negotiations can get intense, right? I've dealt in the past with some not so nice attorneys, but what you want to do is you want to keep calm and you want to get both parties across the finish line. You want to close those deals and you want to make both parties happy at the end of the day.
Perfect. Perfect. And before we head over to the notable points, I just thought about one question. And you could say maybe we don't answer it right now because it might take us a different direction. But it's something that I always tell Julio because we come across a lot of businesses, right? Some business owners, they have crazy ideas, or so they tell us. So they tell us, look, before I share the details of my idea and we see if we want to do marketing, I need you to sign an NDA, right? From what I've learned, you should not sign anything like that because I've read that you're setting yourself up to fall in a trap down the road if something does happen. I don't know if that's something you want to go over. What do you think about NDAs? Should people be signing them maybe before even starting a business, or is that something that you should do once you've already established some intellectual property, any rights, etc.?
So I think that's a fantastic question. I do think there's a lot in there, right? So you got to get into the business owner's shoes as well, right? Because
Yeah,
if you
of
are
course.
working so hard to develop a product, and then if we're gonna go talk with investors, and then I pitch them the idea and they steal my idea, right? No, nobody wants that, right? But I think it's very the question that you're posing right now. I think it's very situation specific,
Hmm.
right? Where typically if an individual is trying to get funding for their project, typically they might ask you for an NDA,
Hmm.
but every NDA is built differently, right? That's why you need to carefully read the document,
Hmm.
and and see if it's something that you're willing to sign, right?
Yeah.
Because sometimes things might get snuck in there, and you don't want that. Typically, what will happen is most large investors, right? People who do this, they invest in different businesses for a living. If they're asked, right, to sign a NDA, they might be hesitant to, right? Because
Mhm.
imagine if my day consists of just going through pitches, I get to sign, I get asked to sign an NDA each and every time. It's gonna, it's gonna be complicated, right? So it's also a thing of trust, right? A thing of trust, that you gotta be wary, right? You gotta. I'm not saying not to do it, but I think it's something that needs to be investigated and needs to be read into carefully,
Yeah.
right? To make sure that you, for example, your interests are covered, and that if the person wants to be protected from you stealing their idea, there are other protections in place, right? For example, if the person is developing, I don't know, some sort of software, some sort of, I don't know, invention that they get patented.
Mhm.
I don't do personally intellectual property. That's not an area that I myself go into. But there are those protections, right?
Yeah. No, I think that's a good point. It's very situational, and I think from my experience, I've come across so many different people. Sometimes they ask for an NDA, but it's not something that I want to sign because unless you're able to follow it and make sure that you keep it in mind at all times. It was an angel investor who mentioned he doesn't sign NDAs because he listens to so many different ideas that it's difficult for him to be able to differentiate.
Right,
So
which is
I thought
exactly
about
what I
asking.
was telling you. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's exactly what I was telling you. I mean, their day is, hearing the pitches from different businesses, and they might just not do it, right? Because they would have to get their attorneys involved, and then that's going to take up most of their time. And then what if then, like, years down, you sue them because they breached the NDA? They don't want that. They don't want that.
Definitely. And then last but not least, and before we go into the Q&A, what are some notable points? Is there anything else that you want to share with us before we get into the Q&A?
Yeah. So I think explaining the practice, and being as transparent with clients is extremely important, right? So my job as a transactional attorney, right? What I do is I prevent, right? And I think the practice of law in itself is very outdated, in that sometimes you'll get a document, right, and you will not have any idea what it says, because it's legal, like mumbo jumbo, right? And I think
Hmm.
that's very outdated. And what we're seeing is a lot of firms, and even the teachings at school are that you want to be clear and concise, and you want to be as make sure that your point gets across. You want to make sure
Hmm.
that your point gets across, that your client's interests are put in a very clear and concise way, right? Because at the end of the day, if something's ambiguous, what ends up happening if is it goes to court, and then it could go either way, right? Um,
Yeah, it's a
so
lot to
you
figure
don't
out.
want that, right? It's tough to figure out, and the intentions of the parties. For example, when you sign an agreement 4 years ago, they might not be the same 4 years later, right? And unfortunately, right, um, going back again about the operating agreement, um, with when you have business partners, right, it's just like any relationship, where in the beginning it might be fantastic, and then you have to have some sort of exit plan just in case the business falls through, or you guys want to get bought out, or things like that. So I think keeping that in mind, and having a lawyer who's willing to put everything in writing in a clear and concise manner is extremely important. And yeah, man, I think, like, being clear and to the point is key in this practice. And it's not only good for us as attorneys, because we're able to communicate better, because at the end of the day, most of the negotiations take place by trading drafts, right? So what I mean by that
Mhm.
is, for example, I'll trade drafts with opposing counsel, with the attorney on the other side, and that's how most negotiations get done. There'll be like a round of drafts, and they'll scratch out what they don't want, and then I scratch out what I don't want. I add what I want, things like that, and then that could go on for weeks and months, right? And what clients,
Sounds
what they
like
don't,
sales.
right, and what they don't want,
Yeah.
is to be spending all of this money because you wrote something that makes no sense, right? They want
Hmm.
something that they can understand, themselves that's in plain English, and that's
Mhm.
going to get them what they want.
Great. Great. And I think that that just sets forth expectations, and that definitely helps just everyone be on the same page.
Right.
Perfect. And then what we're going to do now is we're going to open up the space to any questions. So if you have any questions and you're on LinkedIn, make sure to add them in the comments section. They should be able to show up here, and then we'll be able to take it from there. So there is one question from Sean. How do you determine the right name for your business, Fabian?
That's a great question, right? So when you're starting off a business, um, right, I can't start my business and have the same name as Ren Marketing, right? Because then how would we be able to tell them apart? So what we
Yeah.
do is we go into the Secretary of State, their database for businesses, right? So you'll type in the name
Mhm.
that you want, and for example, if you're an LLC, there's statutory requirements for the name that you want to have. So for an LLC, for example, one of those requirements is that the letters LLC have to be in there, right? And one of the things that you cannot
Mhm.
do is you can't be like, oh, I'm affiliated with a federal agency or a state agency. You cannot do that. So my name cannot be called Florida Cupcake Agency. No, because then that's going to be misleading,
Mhm.
right? So you
Mhm.
you look up that name, and if it's not in use, then you will be able to use it, so long as it complies with the statutory requirements. But typically that's easy to do, right? And that something that's important that a lot of people overlook as well is the commas before the LLC, or without a comma. Those things do make a difference as well.
They're big. Yeah,
Yeah.
they're completely different businesses.
Yeah, but I strongly advise not to have, like, for example, if the only thing that's going to separate you and the other business is a comma, I would change the name, right? Because you don't want to make you want to make things as clear as possible that it's you, that business, separate from the other business,
Yeah.
right?
I can
But
just
yeah.
imagine having the same business on Google Maps, just with just a slight little comma that drives people crazy.
Right, right. And for example, when I was creating this company, for example, there's another one I think in Washington with a similar. I think it's Apex Legal Services, right? And but that's in Washington, right? And this is Apex Legal
Mhm.
Solutions, and I think they might have had the same name actually, but that one
Mhm.
was in Washington, and this was here in Florida. So as long as here in Florida, it's different. You should be good to go.
Okay, perfect. That's a good point. So before creating a business, make sure that you look up the names on Sunbiz in this case. Would it be Sunbiz or is there another
Yeah,
place
it's
to go to?
Sunbiz. It's Sunbiz. Yeah. So Sunbiz is like the go-to where, when you want to create your company, when you want to, make sure that you're not taking anybody else's name. For the LLCs, when you want to do your annual reports, right? Because you have to pay, I think, a little over $100 every year for your annual reports. If you don't do that,
Yeah,
then your
which
LLC
is
goes
which is
inactive.
due soon. Which is due soon.
Yes. Yes.
May 1st, I
Um,
think.
Yes, I think it's January 1st through May 1st is when you need to make those payments. So you want to make sure that your company is in line, um, and yeah, yeah.
Great. And I don't know if anyone else has any more questions. If you do, just add it in the comments below. But just one quick question that I thought about. Any thoughts on fictitious names? Let's say someone has an LLC name and they want to maybe have a different name. Any notes on that? Any things we should keep in mind?
So what you're referring to is the DBAs, right? The doing business as.
Correct. Yeah.
Typically, what you see is a lot of sole proprietorships use the DBA, right? For example, Fabian DBA, Fabian's Best Cupcakes, right? Because I haven't
Mhm.
filed anything, right? I think that the use of fictitious names is completely okay. I think it's a practice that's people do. Um, for the reasons, I mean, each business person has their own reasons, but me personally, I would just change the name of the LLC altogether. Though if you're going to change that, then that might lead to some complications, and that you have to file the articles of organization again, you have to amend your operating agreement, that you might have to vote on changing the name and things like that. So I can't see why, but I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with using a fictitious name. I think so long as you're not getting mixed up with any other company, you should be good. And why were you thinking of
Perfect.
using a fictitious name?
No, so I've done that in the past with a company I've opened, and I've had a fictitious name. But because I remember reading online that legally, if your business is Ren Marketing LLC, that you need to do business as Ren Marketing LLC, right? And let's say you wanted to go as Ren Marketing, you would need to get a DBA or something like that.
Yeah.
No, but the main reason was that it's for sometimes you come up with a business name like an LLC, and it's not the nicest name when you think about it again, right? I don't know if you remember Gel Services.
No.
So Julio and I and Jonas, we had a company a few years ago that we had an LLC name. I believe it was an LLC, and the name just wasn't that good after a few months in.
Mhm.
We didn't like the name anymore, like the company name. So we filed a fictitious name with that. I think it was an LLC, I believe, and that made it easier because the name that we came up with was a lot more presentable. For example,
Mhm.
right? So let's
Right.
say you call your company Cupcakes 24, right? At AOL. I don't know. But that might not look so presentable, but changing it up to something like Miami Cupcakes. I don't know,
Right.
that's how I saw it. But I wanted to bring it up because just so if someone doesn't know that that's possible, it is. Just the annoying thing is I think you have to spend a few bucks on putting it on like a magazine to publicize it. That's like one
Mm.
of the rules with the fictitious thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing with the name is very interesting, right? Because now that you said that you were starting another company, I had the same thing happen to me a couple months back. That I was super excited with the name of the company, right?
Uh-huh.
And I showed up, I went on Sunbiz, I looked it up, and it was taken, and I was like, I spent so many hours trying to come up with this name. But
Yeah,
yeah, I mean, um, I think what you're saying is correct, about the fictitious name, and I would just use the same name as your LLC, to avoid any issues and to avoid any extra money, right? Um,
yeah.
that's pretty much how
No,
I
I
would go
agree.
about it. Yeah, yeah, and
I agree. I
there's
love Ren Marketing LLC.
yeah, no, me too. I think it's a great name. But yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of other things that also go into creating your own company, obviously. And we try to keep it as simple as possible, for people who are starting out. But there's a lot of intricacies, and I would highly suggest like hiring an attorney to guide you through that, right? Because it can get complex. The documents can get tricky. You don't want to be taken advantage of by and if you're doing business with anybody else, you don't want to be taken advantage of there. And if you have a partner, you want to make sure that both of you are protected, right? You want to make sure that both of you are getting what you
Definitely,
want out of the company, and things like that.
definitely. And then that brings me to my next point. So Fabian, if people want to contact you, I have your email here. Is there anything else you want to say? I know that a lot of people always think about starting a business. I have a lot of friends who always tell me, "I'm going to start a business. I'm going to start a business," and they just need to know how to take the first step, right? I think that hopefully this video has helped a lot of those people to be able to understand what they can do to get started. So
Right.
I love how Fayez is like, keep Ren Marketing. We're not thinking about doing a fictitious name for Ren Marketing, man. We love it just the way it is. But in the case that someone wants to get started working with an attorney, in this case you, to be able to set up a business, what are the next steps? Have your email here. Is that the best way? Anything else?
Yeah. So the best way to get in contact with me is just shoot me an email. Let me know that you want to schedule we could do an initial consultation, and we'll discuss what your goals are with your business, and what it is that you want to do. And then we figure out a course of action. What I like to do is I love face to face contact instead of doing things virtually. So I'm always
Mhm,
open to meeting up with clients and sitting down with them and kind of going over what it is that they'll need,
mhm.
and how we go forward, right? Um, I know that that's not always possible, because people like to travel and things like that.
Of course.
But I like to kind of set up like, a very, I like to make it very clear what it is that we need to do. I always like to keep my clients informed, let them know like, hey, we're going to be drafting your operating agreement. Is this what you want? Right? Oh, you
Mhm.
don't want this? Okay, not a problem. We'll take it out. And, have like weekly check-ins if that's what they want, give them updates and things like that. So I think, yeah, that's the best way to reach me. And then just let me know, and we can chat, and I'd be more than happy to assist.
Great, great, and I do appreciate you being on this live stream. I'm going to be doing a few more over the next few weeks, hopefully. Right, it's just a matter of getting other people who are going to be able to share something valuable to other people who are either thinking about starting a business or who already have a business. Which brings me to my next point. So, if you have not connected with me yet and you want to be a part of the next couple of live streams, make sure to connect with me on LinkedIn. The beauty about this program is that I want to send Fabian the recording as well, so he'll be able to share it with anyone who's interested. And this video will live on LinkedIn, so you can always refer to it back later whenever you have any questions. So, without that being said, Fabian, is there anything else you want to add?
No, man, I just wanted to thank you for having me on again, and thank you for those watching, and thank you for those watching in the future, right, with the recordings. And, I was very happy to be here.
Definitely.
And then if there's anything that, I can do to assist you or anybody that was viewing this, again, I'd be more than happy to. Just shoot me an email.
Perfect, Fabian. Well, thank you very much, Fabian, for your time, and everyone else who participated. Thank you very much for your time, and best of luck with your projects, and hopefully with your new business. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.